Welcome to today's deep dive.
Mm.
I am so thrilled you are joining us today because the stack of sources sitting in front of us is, frankly, completely wild.
Yeah, it really is.
I want you to imagine, just for a second, what happens when you take ancient spiritual frameworks, I mean, things like the veneration of saints, sacred rituals, apocalyptic prophecies, and you take all that and drop it directly into the absolute center of the 2026 culture wars.
It creates a highly unusual, fascinating intersection to explore. Today, we are looking at a collection of foundational documents, open letters, and some very recent blog posts from a relatively new religious movement. They call themselves the Universal Rainbow Faith.
Or the URF, for short.
Right, the URF. And these writings were primarily authored just recently, so between January and March of 2026, by the movement's founder, Reverend Paula Josephine Sadler.
And our mission for this deep dive with you today is to really figure out what the URF is attempting to do here. We are going to unpack how this organization is operating right at the crossroads of mysticism, traditional spirituality, and LGBTQ plus advocacy. Looking at these documents, they are essentially trying to position themselves as a sanctuary, like a kind of spiritual armor, against what they describe as a modern moral panic and the dehumanization of marginalized groups. But before we get into the weeds of all this, I need to make a really crucial disclaimer for you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely. Considering the stack of sources we are dealing with today, this context is completely essential before we begin analyzing the material.
The texts we're exploring dive headfirst into some of the most highly charged, incredibly sensitive political topics dominating the news right now.
Yeah.
I mean, these documents touch on recent state legislation, major political figures like Donald Trump, broad political movements like Project 2025, and highly public cultural debates involving figures like J.K. Rowling. So we want to be absolutely clear up front. This deep dive is not endorsing, validating, or taking sides on any of these left-wing or right-wing political issues.
Not at all.
Our goal is purely to impartially report on the worldview of the Universal Rainbow Faith and Reverend Sadler's specific theological perspectives exactly as they are outlined in the provided texts. We are here to understand their arguments, not to argue for them or against them.
We're acting simply as a mirror to the source material. It's an exercise in understanding how one specific, new spiritual movement is processing the highly polarized world around it right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the beginning. The Universal Rainbow Faith was formally established very recently on February 6, 2025. And when you look at their founding declaration, they establish a very clear, very bold core doctrine right out of the gate.
They do.
They state that they believe, fundamentally, that gender, love, and identity are sacred and divine.
And we really need to pause on that specific phrasing because it is not accidental. If you think about how gender identity and sexual orientation are typically discussed in our contemporary debates, it's almost always framed in legal, medical, or sociological terms.
Right, exactly.
You hear arguments about civil rights, healthcare access, or demographic shifts. But what Reverend Sadler is doing in these foundational documents is taking those concepts and elevating them entirely into the realm of the holy.
It's a massive shift in categorization.
It really is. By declaring that a person's identity is intrinsically divine, any legislative or cultural attack on that identity isn't just viewed as a civil rights violation anymore. It's framed as a literal spiritual offense against the sacred.
And what caught my eye is that they don't just put this on a mission statement and call it a day. They actually operationalize it for their members.
Yeah.
The URF offers specific sacred rites and rituals to back up this doctrine.
Yeah, the ceremonies.
The most prominent one in the sources is their name and pronoun ceremony, which comes with an actual physical name and pronoun certificate.
Which is a brilliant tactical move from a sociological perspective. Just think about the standard process of changing your name or gender marker legally.
It's basically a trip to the DMV. It's bureaucratic. It involves filling out endless forms, paying fees, and often standing in front of a judge or a clerk who might not be particularly sympathetic to you. It can be a very cold, clinical, and sometimes painful process.
Right. What the URF is doing is taking that clinical bureaucracy and replacing it with a religious rite of passage. It anchors an individual's transition or self-realization within a supportive spiritual community. It gives the moment profound, recognized weight.
The texts give a really specific example of this with a member named Renee Nicole. Reverend Sadler breaks down the etymology in one of her posts to show how the URF ties this directly to spiritual renewal.
I love that part.
She explains that Renee comes from the Latin for reborn or born again, which of course is a massive universal spiritual theme of transformation across so many religions. And Nicole comes from the Greek for victory of the people, speaking to collective dignity and community survival. So taking a new name isn't just about personal preference for them. It is a public spiritual witness.
What's fascinating here is how the URF also contextualizes its founding within the broader sweep of history and sacred time. This isn't just about reacting to the headlines of 2026. Reverend Sadler writes quite extensively about 2026 being the year of the fire horse.
Wait, the year of the fire horse? I know that concept comes from the Chinese zodiac, but what does an ancient astrological calendar have to do with a newly founded church focusing on LGBTQ plus advocacy?
It comes down to how they view the concept of time. In their theology, time isn't just a ticking clock moving in a straight line. They view it as a series of repeating sacred cycles.
Okay.
The year of the fire horse is a specific astrological cycle that returns only once every 60 years. So Sadler asks her followers to look back exactly 60 years to the last time we were in the year of the fire horse,
Which would be?
which was 1966, spanning into 1967.
Oh, wow. Okay, so 1966. That is right in the boiling point of the civil rights struggles, massive cultural upheaval, and just a couple of years before the Stonewall riots, which really ignited the modern LGBTQ plus rights movement.
That is the exact parallel she is drawing. The URF teaches that 2026 is carrying that exact same recurring historical energy. It's a volatile but necessary energy of courage, revelation, and profound transformation.
So they aren't seeing this as a new fight.
Exactly. For a follower of this faith, they are framing the current intense cultural battles not as unprecedented modern chaos, but as a scheduled sacred historical test that humanity is meant to face again.
Which perfectly sets the stage for how they view current events and holidays. I want to talk about their Valentine's Day post because this completely blew my mind.
Yeah.
They take a holiday that most of us associate with greeting cards, dinner reservations, and heart-shaped chocolates, and they completely flip it on its head.
They strip away centuries of commercialism and go straight back to the historical and theological roots of the actual martyr, St. Valentine.
Yes. Sadler reminds her readers that St. Valentine was a real 3rd century priest who was executed by the state. And why was he executed? Because he was performing secret marriages that the Roman Empire had strictly outlawed.
Right.
He believed that love was sacred, even when the government explicitly said it was illegal. The URF takes that ancient historical tension, the clash between a sacred marriage doctrine and a restrictive empire, and applies it directly to the 2026 legislative landscape.
And we see this clash vividly documented in the open letters Reverend Sadler has published. The URF isn't just looking inward, they're actively responding to state legislatures. For instance, the texts include a direct response to Tennessee's HB 1473 and SB 1746.
Let me jump in here with a quick civics refresher for anyone listening. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees equal protection under the law for all citizens. That is the legal backbone for a lot of civil rights, including the federal recognition of same-sex marriage.
Exactly.
According to the sources, these recent bills in Tennessee essentially asserted that private citizens, like county clerks, are not bound by the 14th Amendment to recognize same-sex marriages, and the legislation actually used the word purported to describe those unions.
And that specific word, purported, becomes a massive focal point for the URF. In a legal sense, purported means something is claimed to be true, but is actually false or invalid.
It's a very loaded term.
Very. In her open letter, Sadler argues that this isn't just procedural or administrative language. When the law calls a marriage between two people purported, the URF views this as a direct spiritual attack. To them, the state legislature is once again stepping into the historical role of the Roman Empire, attempting to dictate what is and isn't a holy union.
So they aren't just writing theological blog posts, they are treating political advocacy as a religious duty. The sources are full of these fiercely worded, very public letter-writing campaigns aimed at major political figures.
They're definitely not staying quiet.
We've got open letters to Utah Governor Spencer Cox condemning bans on gender-affirming care. There's a letter to Representative Andrew Clyde in the U.S. Congress calling out the intentional misgendering of transgender individuals. And there is a particularly aggressive letter to Oklahoma State Senator David Bullard, where Sadler explicitly states, "This is not about marriage, this is not about religion, this is about the systematic erasure of LGBTQ plus people."
This raises an important question, though, about how the URF diagnoses the root cause of all this legislation. Why do they think this is happening right now?
Good question.
Reverend Sadler attempts to answer this in a piece titled A Letter from the Future. She writes that she is actively trying to step back from standard partisan labels. She claims she isn't speaking as a far leftist or a far rightist, but as a human being observing a recurring historical pattern.
Okay.
She diagnoses the current political climate and specifically calls out conservative platforms like Project 2025 as being symptoms of what she terms white panic.
Let's define that, because Project 2025 gets thrown around a lot in the news. For those who might not read political think pieces all day, Project 2025 was a sweeping blueprint proposed by conservative think tanks aiming to significantly reshape the federal government and its policies.
Right.
Sadler connects this kind of political movement to white panic. She describes this panic as a deep-seated systemic fear that others are taking over. It's a fear driven by shifting demographics, shifting cultural norms, and a perceived loss of power. She argues this panic historically always leads directly to the dehumanization of marginalized groups.
She views these legislative moves not as isolated incidents of policy debate, but as a holistic, cyclical effort to erode civil rights, driven purely by that underlying fear. And she doesn't just apply this lens to politicians, she applies it to major cultural features as well.
Yes. Which brings us to the open letter she wrote, addressed to J.K. Rowling and the billionaires who amplify similar beliefs. Now, in this letter, Sadler pushes back incredibly hard on the concept of biological essentialism. And for our listeners, biological essentialism is basically the idea that human identity and gender are strictly defined by innate binary biological traits, like chromosomes or anatomy, and that these traits are fixed and unchangeable.
Right. It's the argument that biology is destiny and that there are only two rigid categories.
But I want to play devil's advocate here for a second, because the evidence Sadler uses to counter this is really unconventional. She doesn't just quote scripture or cite medical journals. She draws on her own 30 years of experience working in the beauty industry.
It's an interesting pivot.
I can hear skeptics right now saying, hold on, she's talking about makeup and skincare. How does a career in the beauty industry qualify as evidence against biological essentialism? How does she bridge that logical gap?
It is a really interesting rhetorical approach. She is arguing from a phenomenological standpoint, meaning based on direct lived observation. She argues that having spent 3 decades up close with every imaginable variation of human physical presentation—
Like faces and body types.
Exactly, studying thousands of faces, varying bone structures, different voice pitches, body types, she has seen firsthand that nature itself is not neatly categorized. Her argument is that the idea of a strict binary biological essentialism ignores the vast, natural, undeniably messy diversity of humanity.
That makes a lot of sense when you frame it that way.
She uses her lived professional experience observing human bodies to validate the URF's theological stance that diversity is the natural divine order and that rigid binaries are a human construct.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
It's about the sheer variety of human presentation. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. We spent a lot of time talking about their advocacy, their legal arguments, their cultural critiques. But at its core, the URF is deeply, unapologetically mystical.
Very much so.
They have a highly spiritual approach to global geopolitical events that goes way beyond standard political commentary.
You are referring to the documentation in the sources regarding her remote viewing of the Middle East conflict.
Yes, this was fascinating. So the texts document that back in July 2025, the United States bombed Iranian nuclear sites. Normally, a religious leader might write an op-ed calling for peace or asking for prayers, but Reverend Sadler claims she entered into a remote viewing. Can you give a quick ELI 5 on what she means by that in this context? Because she didn't just sit and meditate, right?
In the context of her writings, remote viewing is described as a deep psychic meditation designed to transcend physical space and reveal hidden truths or the unseen realities behind world events. It's a practice of trying to spiritually witness an event as it unfolds, or to see the underlying motivations that aren't being reported on the news.
So she meditates on an international airstrike. And her conclusions from this remote viewing attempt to reframe the entire geopolitical narrative. She stated that what she saw in her vision was deeply disturbing because, according to her, the war did not actually have to happen.
Right.
Her meditation supposedly revealed that behind closed doors, peace negotiations were actively underway and a diplomatic resolution was fully at hand.
Which casts the subsequent events, the bombing, the ensuing war, and the death of Ayatollah Khamenei in a completely different light. She writes that these events were not strategic political victories for the U.S. or Israel as they might be framed in a geopolitical sense. Instead, she explicitly calls it spiritual warfare upon the soul of humanity.
Wow.
She argues that innocent lives were lost and the hope of an entire region was set on fire purely for the sake of power, not necessity.
It's a completely mystical, highly empathetic lens applied to a brutal military conflict. It really highlights how they view the world.
It underscores a core tenet of their theology, the belief that all people, regardless of their nation, religion, or political affiliation, are intimately spiritually connected. Therefore, unnecessary violence against anyone, anywhere, is a spiritual wound to everyone.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. But honestly, what I find equally fascinating is how the URF balances this heavy, mystical, global worldview with incredibly approachable, everyday cultural touchstones.
Oh, I could not wait to talk about this part. They literally use pop culture as theology. It makes their teachings so accessible. They aren't just sitting around pointing at ancient, dusty scrolls. They're pointing at movies and TV shows to explain their spiritual worldview to their followers. For instance, they heavily reference the 2023 sci-fi movie The Shift.
Yes, Sadler describes The Shift as a modern-day telling of the biblical story of Job, but set in a dystopian multiverse. She uses the narrative of that film to ask her followers a very ancient question. If everything is taken away from you, your comfort, your rights, your status, will you still choose goodness and truth?
And it doesn't stop with recent sci-fi movies. She pulls up an episode of the television show Touched by an Angel from 1995. So let me get this straight. She's using a 30-year-old episode of a 90s network drama called The Last Temptation of Andrew to explain complex spiritual concepts. That is incredibly creative, but also kind of baffling.
She views that specific piece of 90s television fiction not just as entertainment, but as an unheeded prophecy. She argues the episode accurately depicted the seduction of power, the ease of deception, and the danger of losing one's moral compass.
That's a deep read of Touched by an Angel.
To the URF, it was a cultural warning broadcasted 30 years ago that the world collectively failed to listen to. It shows a fundamental belief that spiritual truths are constantly being broadcasted through art, media, and culture if people only have the eyes to see it.
They even put out a public statement supporting Bad Bunny.
They did.
The URF holds up the Grammy-winning Puerto Rican artist as a literal symbol of cultural resilience, freedom of expression, and human dignity in the face of mockery and exclusion. They are finding the divine in pop stars, 90s television, and multiverse movies. It is such a unique way to build a theology.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, all of these seemingly random pop culture references are actually serving a much deeper, very cohesive theological argument about the nature of good and evil in the modern world. And we see this most clearly in how the URF reimagines the concept of the Antichrist.
Right, because usually when people hear the word Antichrist, they picture a very specific, singular, cartoonish villain at the end of the world, like a guy with horns bringing about the apocalypse.
Precisely the opposite of how Sadler views it. She draws on the book of Revelation and the first epistle of John to argue something far more unsettling. The URF interprets the Antichrist not as a single evil person who will suddenly appear, but as a recurring systemic spiritual pattern.
A pattern.
Yes. The scripture she cites says, "Even now many antichrists have come." Sadler teaches that this antichrist pattern emerges historically whenever institutional power completely divorces itself from truth, humility, and love.
So it's not a monster coming out of the ocean. It's a systemic corruption of humanity. Under their definition, the Antichrist is legislation that erases marginalized people, or it's empires that restrict who you can love, or it's choosing to start a war when peace was on the table. It is the banality of systemic evil.
Exactly. By defining evil as a repeating systemic pattern of dehumanization rather than a singular boogeyman, the URF provides its followers with a highly structured framework to understand the chaotic, often frightening events of 2026. It's not the end of the world. It's simply the return of an ancient, recognizable spiritual challenge. And they teach that this challenge must be met with courage, community, and solidarity.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening to this deep dive right now, looking at all these documents? I think the big aha moment here is really observing how the universal rainbow faith is operating.
Yeah, their methods.
They are taking deeply traditional, ancient religious architectures. We're talking about the veneration of martyrs, sacred marriage rites, the interpretation of prophecies, and the concept of sacred astrological time. And they are utilizing all of it to build a profound spiritual armor.
And giving it to the people who need it.
Exactly. They are providing that armor to marginalized groups who are currently exhausted from fighting highly secular political and legal battles in 2026. They are taking the terrifying feeling of being legislated against or debated on the news and turning it from a source of despair into a badge of sacred spiritual endurance.
It is a remarkable synthesis of ancient form and very urgent modern function. And it leaves us with a compelling final thought to consider as we wrap up. The URF heavily emphasizes that humanity operates in these repeating cycles, whether it is the 60-year return of the transformative energy of the fire horse or the recurring archetype of the Antichrist whenever political power becomes corrupted by panic.
They really don't believe in a straight line of history. It's all cyclical.
Yes. So the question to mull over on your own after we sign off is this. If history truly is cyclical, rather than a straight linear line of progress, what past eras' unresolved spiritual or cultural debts are we currently paying off today? And perhaps more importantly, when the historians of tomorrow look back at the cycle we are living in right now in 2026, what will they call it?
That is a lot to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the universal rainbow faith. We love unpacking these complex real-time sources with you, and we will catch you on the next one.
Thank you for listening. Keep asking questions.